Welcome back to Bold Books and Bones. This is my first podcast and it's called BBX, which stands, of course, for Bold Books and Bones. My first guest on the BBX podcast is Richard Ovenden. He is responsible for one of the largest and probably one of the most famous libraries in the world. We are, of course, talking about the Bodleian Library of the University of Oxford. And yes, this is also the library where they filmed parts of the Harry Potter movies, so it is a famous place in many ways. Richard is the 25th librarian who serves in this position since the opening of the library in 1602. And recently he published a book with the title Burning the Books, A History of Knowledge Under Attack. When a man in his position writes a book with this title, then maybe there is something going on that we need to know. And there absolutely is something going on that is changing our society and even threatening the essence of our democracies. I invited him as the first guest on the BBX podcast so that you and I can learn all about the attack on knowledge that we face in this digital age. Can't wait to share the episode with you. So here we go. Hi, Richard.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. It's very early morning for you, I guess.
It is, yeah. But it's a beautiful day here. It's a cool, crisp, blue skies. Autumn in Oxford is always a wonderful time of year, so it's very much like that here this morning.
And you have a beautiful backdrop. It's not a fake one; it's a real one. You are in the library at the moment, right?
Absolutely. I'm in the oldest part of the Bodleian Libraries. This is called Duke Humphreys Library. It's a reading room that was first opened to readers in 1488. And it's the site of a great chapter in the history of knowledge, the destruction of the medieval library of the university. But then it was the site of a reconstruction in the early 17th century. So just last Sunday is the anniversary of the opening of this room to readers in its rebuilt state in 1602.
Wow.
So 418 years of scholarship, study, preservation, and access to knowledge.
Wow. Thank you very much for being a guest at Bold Books and Bones. But when I read your book, I had a lot of new insights about the importance of libraries, not only for a community or for a society, but even more specifically for the protection of our democracy. And I really wasn't aware of that. And I also realized that before I read your book and I was talking with friends or family members, then sometimes a topic of libraries comes up, and then, there is sometimes questions like, why do they still exist, or are they not more becoming museums because they're not relevant anymore in our digital age? And I must admit, I did not have a clear vision about it. Of course, it feels intuitively wrong because I love books, but I did not know why are they still there and why are they so important, and especially for our democracy. So I thought the following. I contacted the followers of Bold Books and Bones on Instagram and on YouTube, on the YouTube community. And I asked them, what if an ignorant and cynical person would meet the librarian of a very famous and important library? What would this person ask about libraries and about archives? And I got quite some responses, and I choose a few of their questions. I selected a few of them, and I would love to put them in front of you. Is that okay?
Sure, yeah, please go ahead. Can't wait.
So, disclaimer, the people who wrote these questions, they are all people who love books and are very passionate, otherwise they wouldn't follow the channel. And for the sake of this format, it's just to get the best possible answers for very difficult questions. By the way, I called, let's call the person who's going to ask you question IC, from Ignorant Cynical person. And here's his first question. So here we go. So Richard, you wrote in your book, and I quote, "We are at a moment in history where knowledge is changing dramatically in the way we interact with it. The age we now live in is an era of digital abundance, and that has a lot of implications for our daily lives. IC asks, of course, so what, Richard? Why would we even care?
Well, I think we should care for a number of reasons. So firstly, because we should be aware that the platforms on which knowledge is stored and made available and in which we interact with it are actually owned by a small number of very, very powerful companies. And the creation of data, which is what we do when we interact with knowledge in a digital world, we create data by the mere fact of searching for it or the mere fact of interacting with it. And that gives growing power to those companies because it means they understand us, because they're able to monitor and surveil our engagement with knowledge. And the information they gain about us, they can use in a number of ways. Firstly, they can target advertising at us and get us to spend money in ways that they think we might be susceptible. But increasingly, we know that they can influence elections by channeling targeted political advertising or political messaging, even more subtle, not really overt advertising, but subtle messaging in order to influence the democratic process. And we have no visibility of that. We have known, until very recently, we had no knowledge that this was even taking place. And I think for a democracy, for an open society, and for one which relies on free elections, has relied on the exchange of public information about political life, in order for the electorate to make informed decisions, that this is a dark thing that is going on. There's always been, attempts to influence electorates, but it's been mostly in the open. And when it hasn't been, it's been illegal. What we have at the moment is a huge, vast and growing grey area. And I think that if we had an archive of that social media data, the data that we create for free, every nanosecond of every day, there are thousands and thousands of interactions which create this data. If we had an archive of it, if we had access to it, even if it was, it would have to be anonymized and so on. And even if we didn't get access to it for some time ahead, that sheer fact that there is a store of it will give society some control back. And I think more than that, we need to think that libraries and archives should be bodies in which society entrusts their own knowledge, as they have actually for thousands of years. But we need them to play a role in this digital world, this world of digital abundance, this world of data, so that society can be protected against the private superpowers.
Okay, thank you very much. Especially your chapter in the chapters in your book, The Digital Delusion, Paradise Lost, where they address specifically this kind of topics. And it was really an eye-opener for me. This is where I really start to understand, oh, that is why he wrote this book. This is why it's so important that in these days, especially. Okay, so let's go to the second question of IC, the Ignorant Cynic. Are libraries as storage places of knowledge not actually a thing of the past? All information can be stored now online. So who needs libraries or archives, Richard?
Yeah, well, this is a wonderful question because I'm actually, not only as I'm responsible for a great library, but I'm also the president of a body called the Digital Preservation Coalition, which is a group of organizations, not just libraries and archives and museums, but banks, the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority in the United Kingdom, the UK Atomic Energy Authority. So we cannot, we must be careful not to make the mistake of equating storage with preservation. Storage is just keeping something static for a while. Preservation is making sure that something can be used long into the future. And they are very different tasks. They're part of a continuum. But I think that in the digital world, we cannot make the mistake that knowledge survives as it does in the analog world, in what we in the library sector call regimes of benign neglect. So, paper, parchment, and papyrus can exist over very long periods of time without us having to do very much to keep it usable. So, we have a book in this library, an entire book that was written in the 5th century, and you can read it without any electricity. All you need is daylight, and it's perfectly readable. Every single letter on every single page is absolutely legible, as it was when it was written more than 1,500 years ago. The same is not true of the emails that I sent 10 years ago. So, operating systems changed, software environments changed, standards changed, we have bit rot, we have all sorts of actions which need to be taken to ensure that digital information can be used. And that is called preservation. And I think that that task is one which a relatively small group of organizations, so the Digital Preservation Coalition now has over 100 members, but that's, just think of the number of bodies around the world, corporate bodies, institutions, public sector bodies that create digital information. I mean, it's hundreds of thousands. And if they are to be able to preserve the information that they need or that they think society might need in 100 years from now, they all need to be actively engaged in digital preservation. And I think that's one of society's major challenges, and one that I hope that the book draws some attention to. Take nuclear waste, the storage of nuclear waste. This is something that takes place over a very long period of time. So if we bury nuclear waste in the ground, we need to know not just next week or 5 years from now, but 5,000 years from now, what the nuclear waste was made of, when was it created, how much of it is there, what was the storage container it was put in. Vast amounts of information need to be readable and understandable and legible long into the future. Otherwise, our successors will find themselves in major trouble. So that's perhaps an extreme example, but there are many, many other use cases where the preservation of knowledge and the role that libraries and archives are centers of expertise, centers of scaled operations, and enduring institutions that will exist, just as we, as a library here in Oxford, the building I'm sat in, was constructed 600 years ago, but that actually was a successor to a library that was begun even earlier, 700 years ago this year. So we have a long track record of keeping knowledge, and I think that's why libraries and archives for society are the places where we should entrust digital information if we need it to be accessible long into the future.
Yeah. And I think the many case studies that you have in your book really illustrate the long-term importance of preservation, actually. I think there's also a recent case in your book. You described the one, I think, in New Zealand, where they are experimenting with it, where digital information from Facebook is stored in libraries. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I think one of the aspects of our current age is that we have knowledge being created on platforms which are controlled and owned by a small number of major technology companies. My colleague here in Oxford, Timothy Garton-Ash, the professor of European history, calls them private superpowers because they spread across the globe. They're not subject to any one legal jurisdiction. They're private companies. They're owned either by shareholders or by a small number of private individuals, and they have immense power. They have not only immense numbers of users, but immense wealth that they're able to kind of reinvest in the control of knowledge. And in order to gain an archives of society, I think libraries and archives should be creating archives of social media data. Now, the big technology companies like Facebook don't want that to happen. They're not very collaborative with libraries and archives in enabling them to take hold of data and preserve it. So what the National Library of New Zealand is doing is asking Facebook users to donate their own profile. So that's one thing that a Facebook user can do, is to save their own profile and to send it and with all sorts of permissions and confidentiality agreements and all sorts of kind of a legal framework that's very kind of sound and in favor of the individual. But they can donate it to the National Library of New Zealand, who can then build up a picture of what New Zealand is life is like through this extraordinary platform, because they are extraordinary things. There are many, many good things about social media. I'm a social media user myself and gain a lot from it, but we should be aware of the dangers that go alongside the benefits.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to the next question of IC, the Ignorant Cynic. So can you tell me why I should care about libraries and archives? What does a library or an archive do for me? Libraries are for scholars, and that is just a small part of society, Richard.
I couldn't disagree more. So yes, okay, I'm sat here in a great scholarly library which has millions of collection items, and every day thousands of students and scholars come into the library's buildings or access our information online. But actually, we're a small, there are a couple of hundred academic libraries in the UK, but there are still thousands of public libraries, and there are also special libraries. So, the public library system is where I grew intellectually and culturally, and as a human. I grew up in a household which didn't have many books. My parents were very hardworking, but didn't attend university. They didn't have access to lots of money which enabled them to buy books. But I had a public library where I could go for free. My mother took me there when I was a small child. It became a normal part of my life to go there, and I, as a teenager, had access to thousands of books and spread my own reading enormously. And I think that still happens today. It happens in slightly different ways because we have online information, but there are many people in the country, millions of people in Britain, and the same is true in every part of the world, who don't own a computer, who don't have access to the internet. But if they go into a public library, not only are there people there who can help them use them, but the hardware is there, the internet connection is there. They can use it for free. They can use it without fear that they're being laughed at or sneered at. So that kind of democratic access to knowledge is what libraries provide. And many academic libraries will work either with the public library system or will allow users who aren't members of the university to come in and use their collections. They'll put exhibitions up. So there's this broad educational role that libraries serve their communities with, whether they're through public libraries, academic libraries, or special libraries. But there's also the sense that libraries support other parts of the system. So libraries support performing artists. They'll support TV companies making documentaries. They'll support filmmakers who are making movies. They'll provide that sort of background information that enriches our cultural life in all sorts of ways. The great British TV series Doctor Who, I discovered after working here for 10 years that the person who did the set designs for the Doctor Who series lived in Oxford and came into the Bodleian and did all his work and his background research in the library. And there are many other examples of that in libraries all over the world. So it's not just that sort of educational role, which is at the heart of what libraries do, but there's these other aspects of life. And some of it is preserving communities. You know, earlier this week, the 9th and 10th of November, we commemorate Kristallnacht in Germany. So that's one part, a dark episode in the attacks on not only individuals and communities, but a whole culture, a whole civilization. But actually, through libraries and archives, that civilization has been preserved. That community, that culture has been provided with a framework in which it can be passed from one generation to the next. And that's part of what libraries do and why they're attacked through history, to try to go to the heart of what communities have, what their cultural identity actually is.
Yeah. A couple of months ago, I read the library book by Susan Orlean, and it is really nice. She discovers the library in Los Angeles, and she describes the whole functioning of it. And suddenly you see the many thousands of implications it has for the community and for the whole city and for the wider society, actually. I think it's brilliant that this information is shared and repeated, because I think we tend to forget, we take it for granted. Yeah, that's just a library, but
Absolutely.
it has its vital functions for our society, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's quite a lot of use cases of libraries and archives being used at the moment to address issues like child sex abuse, and particularly in the Catholic Church. So there are a number of very powerful examples. I'm in touch with an archivist in Ireland who is doing a lot of work to try to preserve archives of religious organizations in his country, because they actually hold information which enables individuals who are subject to these horrific acts to seek justice. So libraries and archives are absolutely fundamental tools for social justice.
Very good. Thank you. Let's go to the next question of the ignorant cynic. You know, Richard, I don't need a library. I can find anything I need on my smartphone.
Okay, well, good luck if that's really true. I mean, for a lot of people it will be true, but for a lot of people it's not true. So not only is a lot of knowledge not actually online, and libraries and archives around the world are working very, very hard to digitize their analog collections or to save born digital materials so that they can be preserved and accessed in the future. But a lot of what you find online is only there because a library has it in the first place. And so the idea that libraries are oppositional to the digital world is an invalid equation. You know, that is not what the reality is like. Libraries work as a pivotal node in the knowledge network. So they preserve information, they acquire it, they work with publishers, they work with scholars and academics, they work with private individuals to make sure knowledge is preserved and managed so that it can be accessed. And whether that's through collaborations with commercial publishers so that material can be digitized and put online, or whether it's working with individuals whose archives and collections are preserved, like, say, I don't know, newspapers. So newspaper archives, you know, we have lots of publishers of newspapers and of other publications who want to digitize their own publications backrun to make them available online, who don't actually have it themselves. And they come to us because they know that we've preserved it over long periods of time, and they can be sure that they can access it. So I think that this sense that what you find on your smartphone is there because there are kind of digital fairies somewhere who make it happen. We should remember there are commercial players, there are kind of, knowledge aggregators, there are libraries and archives, and there are a whole host of other players who work to make that happen. And libraries and archives are at the heart of it.
So you're officially stating there are no information fairies existing. There are only real librarians who preserve information.
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, the other thing that libraries and archives do when you look at your smartphone is that if you use a library search engine, you can have extra metadata that isn't being put on your search engine's result list because it's been paid to get there. It's there because it's been selected and curated as trusted sources of information, or if it's not, it's been flagged up as being its provenance as being questionable.
Yeah, I also learned from reading your book that a library is actually a place of freedom. Nobody is tracking what I'm reading. Nobody is pushing information to me that because I already selected something else. Nobody's trying to sell me something. So I have a higher chance of having, or a very fair chance to have very diverse kind of information, and that I'm not stuck into an echo chamber where I only hear one kind of information and get constantly confirmed in it. So I think that is also an important eye opener for me. Like I didn't look at it in this way before, actually.
And I think through history, librarians have been actually quite keen to preserve things which are, if you like, contrary to their own community or culture. So, my predecessors here in the Bodleian were Protestants. There was in, a Protestant university, but they were quite interested in what the Catholics were saying so that they could counteract their arguments. But they deliberately acquired, Catholic material and, were happy to give it places on the shelves.
Very nice. Okay, next question from the Ignorant Cynic. So IC asks, because online platforms that store information are operated by private companies, they work more efficiently than most libraries or traditional archives. Richard?
I couldn't agree more. They're very efficient organizations. They are absolutely ruthless in making profits for themselves. And they make those profits out of our free labor. So if you're happy with that, if you're happy to work for free and to give that money to someone else, then go for it. But if you're not, if you think that actually the knowledge about your own behavior online, the fact that you searched for a flight to Tunisia, the fact that you searched for hotels in Tunisia, the fact that you own a car, that you have 3 credit cards, that you liked a lot of posts that were made by, ABBA fans, or that you liked a particular set of posts on Facebook from a particular political organization. If you are quite happy with all of that information being collected up and put into categories that pigeonhole you as a certain kind of person who's likely to spend money on these kind of things, or is likely to vote for this kind of party, and therefore needs to be encouraged in a different direction or even discouraged from voting at all of this information will be gathered together and sold. All of those likes, all of those posts, all of that searching, all of those credit card information, all of the information about your life is being traded every day. And it's being sold to people who, well, we just don't really know who it is sold to. And we have no control, or very little control, over how we can deal with that. So there's a kind of privacy aspects at one end, at the individual's end, but there's also an openness aspect. And I think libraries have parts to play in both of these things, because the openness that libraries and archives will bring, that transparency, that encourages certain behavior of individuals. So, for example, we have the records of many great politicians, the private papers, and those papers have been subject to legislation which requires processes to enable documents to be kept from politicians and civil servants and other people who are paid to act in public life. Now, what we're finding at the moment is that a number of civil servants and special advisors and politicians are using private communications technologies, particularly encrypted technologies, particularly technologies that auto-delete. So we have no way of knowing what communications between those individuals who we are paying for as the taxpayer, and who are forming public policy, who are forming political ideas that translate themselves into public policy, acts of parliament, laws that then come and influence us. We have no way of knowing what channel, what that dialogue has been. And so we need to be able to ensure that the use of those technologies comes under the framework of the legislation. In the UK, it's the 1958 Public Records Act, in order to create that sense of transparency in public life and integrity in decision-making. Because people will behave differently if they think that those decisions recorded on bits of paper or in noughts and ones in a digital file are going to be subject to scrutiny, either through things like the Freedom of Information Act, or for future historians who may look back on those episodes and say, well, that individual behaved irresponsibly or illegally or without, without authority. And so I think we need to bring that transparency back into public life so that our elected officials can play a proper part in democracy, a proper part in a deliberative democracy where there's debates on both sides. But in order to understand that, we need those discussions to be in the open.
That reminds me of an interview I once saw with Barack Obama when he was elected for his first term. He was in a late night show somewhere, and he realized that he was playing basketball with his bodyguards and stuff, and on his BlackBerry he was sending messages, and some of these messages were a bit funny towards the other guys that he worked with every day, but these people always answered very formal, Mr. President. And then he realized that is because everything he said was archived. Yeah. And the people were aware, like, we are watched. Maybe not now, but maybe in 100 years, and we will be judged on what we do and what we say.
That's a great story. That's
have historical consequences.
Yeah. Presidential Records Act. That's what the legislation in the United States is. And the National Archives and Records Administration in America are now moving into the Trump administration to try to ensure that as much of that material is preserved there. That's going to be quite a task, I think.
I think so. All right. Going to the next question of the ignorant cynic, Mr. IC. Online platforms are obviously more secure than the old-fashioned brick and mortar libraries. So that is another big advantage of online. I want my data to be secured and safe.
Well, I think there's so much that we know about online information and its fragility that I think a statement like that is sadly, extremely dangerous to hold. I think, we do a lot of web archiving here in the Bodleian as part of the UK Web Archive, which is a collaborative effort among 5 libraries in the United Kingdom, 1 in the Republic of Ireland. And we're entitled by law to archive the whole of the UK web domain. And we've been doing it since 2014. And I have the privilege of chairing the committee that oversees that process. And what we know is that the fragility, because we're able to analyze the URLs of the websites we captured in 2014 and to plot their stability over time. So, we're doing the 2020 crawl now. And what we know is that the number of websites that are no longer valid in the archive that we create, it's about 40% after 3 years, 40% of those URLs will no longer be resolvable. So they may have changed their address, but they may also have just vanished altogether. And so the idea that the web is a stable platform, that it's a place where you can put things for preservation, is entirely erroneous. It's a very ephemeral platform indeed. And there's a whole variety of other digital issues around things which aren't even connected to the web. So, we had a famous politician in the UK, Baroness Castle, Barbara Castle, who was a Labour Party cabinet minister. And when she died, she left us her archive. And that was several hundred boxes of paper and 2 PCs. But she didn't leave us the passwords to the PCs. So we had to hack into them to take the data off. And so, there's innumerable examples of that where, people think that because they have it on their hard drive, that it's going to be accessible in the future. But there's so many steps that you have to take in order to ensure that. And if something happens to you, you fall under a bus, will people know where you have your email? Will they have access to your passwords? Do you even remember how many social media accounts or things like Dropbox or Google Mail or Hotmail or whatever that you have and use? So I think we all need, as individuals and as society as a whole, to think more carefully about our digital legacy. And I think libraries and archives should play more of a part in helping individuals through this task. We can't keep everything. There are things which individuals or organizations should keep, that families might want to have for legal or evidential reasons, let alone sentimental or personal ones. And I think we need to build more of that into the education of young people. We need to build tools and technologies. We need to fund libraries and archives to take on more of this role. And in my book, and elsewhere, I've suggested a memory tax on the big tech companies in order to fund that. And just a tiny slice of their vast profits would make a transformational difference in this era.
Okay. Last question from IC. IC says the following to the librarian of the Bodleian. People who are against the digital storage of information are against progress. They live in the past, Richard.
So I think that we shouldn't separate the format in which knowledge is stored. At the end of the day, knowledge is all about enabling the future to operate informed by the past. Now, whether that's climate science, whether that's data science, whether that's just our own family lives, how many secrets are there that have been discovered when a family member dies and their children look through the box of letters that they've kept. So the knowledge that we use today, whether we are overtly using it or whether we're just aware of it, has been created in the past. And whether that's kind of, the data that's come off a scientific instrument 5 minutes ago, or whether it's the beams of light from a dying star billions of years ago, or the sediments of geology in a rock formation, or whether it's the writings of a poet 50 years ago. This, ourselves as individuals, as societies, as communities, we depend on that knowledge being passed down to us so that we reinterpret it, we use it as stepping stones to the future. And I think if we're to be sure-footed as we trip across those stepping stones, we need to understand where that knowledge has come from. We need to understand how strong it is or how weak it is. We need to be able to have confidence that we can go forward at the speed at which we want to, because those stepping stones exist. And librarians and archivists, libraries and archives are bodies that place those stepping stones on the ground for individuals, communities, and society.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you very much for your patience with IC, poor chap.
I enjoyed talking to him. We had a great conversation, I think.
Okay. So thank you very much for your time and your insights. And I have thought many times about your book during the recent elections in the United States and everything that's going on right now. And it's very worrying how information is lost. I think you have the same in the UK, where politicians have claimed something and then have deleted it from their website. And luckily, some organization traced this information to prove that misinformation was given. So we live in very confusing times, and I think your book is really right on time, right, to help to make sense of everything that's going on at the moment.
I hope so. I hope so. Thank you. That's what I was trying to do as I wrote it. And I hope if it sort of brings those issues to the attention of more people, that can only be a good thing.
Mm. At least for me, it was a really big eye opener. So thank you very, very much.
So I think rumors of the death of the library are exaggerated,
to say the least. Yeah. Once the virus is a bit under control, I'm sure I'm going to visit the Bodleian again with my family.
Good. Come and let me know when you can come, and we'll have lunch and give you the full tour.
That would be wonderful. Thank you very much. Right. Have a great day.
Okay, and you. Yeah.
Looking forward to see the success of your book further grow. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening or watching, depending on the platform that you used. And if you want to know more about Richard's book, you can also find an episode on the Bold Books and Bones YouTube channel. And this episode is called Why Do Humans Burn Books? I hope you liked the episode, and if you want to let me know what you think about this first podcast, please leave a message in the comment section. In the meanwhile, please stay free and safe, and I hope to see you next time on Bold Books and Bones. Bye.